Welcome back, guys. So in this particular video, I'll be talking about all the possible prelims questions based on economic survey and the previous year's current affairs on the topic of inflation, which is based on the chapter 5 of our economic survey. This is the chapter prices and inflation. These are the various topics that we'll be discussing in this couple of videos. And before getting into the specifics of this, let us understand the basics of inflation. Basically, inflation means price change or price rise. Let us understand the technical aspects of this for solving questions in preliminary level examination. So this is the index of the chapter, and we'll be basically dealing with what is responsible behind the inflation during COVID times across the globe and also in our country. Inflation is nothing but price rise, as we have already seen in the previous video. So these are the chapters which we'll be dealing, and in the first part of the video, we'll be dealing with all the important things that you need to know from prelims perspective, and the part 2 of the video will be about mains. Moving on. So, as we have already seen in the previous chapter, we'll be dealing with one, the supply side, and two, the demand side of an economy. So, inflation is nothing but a price rise. If it happens on the supply side, it is most likely because producers are impacted. If it happens on the demand side, it is most likely that consumers will be impacted. How do we measure both these indices is the central theme that is often asked in prelims. So, this is actually tracked by CPI or the consumer price index, and here the wholesale price index. Let us understand the basics and also what constitutes the important components for our prelims examination. In the introductory passage of this chapter 5, it was mentioned that on the supply side, one of the major reason is oil non-availability because of supply restrictions from OPEC plus. Now let us understand the important points for prelims examination about this OPEC plus. I'll just explain the basics. OPEC basically is nothing but a lobby that has control over oil reserves across the world. So if this lobby decides that they'll cut down production, the prices of the oil will go up because of lack of availability and vice versa. So OPEC plus constitutes OPEC plus some other countries. If they decide together that they will control the oil prices, then it will lead to an increase in the prices of the oil across the globe, and it will have certain repercussions. What are they? Let us understand. If you want to know more details about this, you can download the PDF from the link that I'll be posting in the description box and read about this for prelims examination. Other important details that you have to remember about OPEC is Russia, despite having huge number of oil resources, and Bahrain, despite being a Gulf country, are not a part of OPEC. They are a part of OPEC plus, a group of 10 other countries along with OPEC countries. So just remember this for prelims examination. Moving on. Let us simply understand the concept of inflation. Let us take the example of a commodity, onion. For every year, if the demand is, let's say, X tons in our country, in a particular year 50% less production happened, and because of that, the onion, which previously, let's say, if it costed us around 100 rupees, both 1 and 2 used to get it at 100 rupees because 2 kgs of onions were available. But since 50% less production happened, you only have 1 kg. So obviously the price would increase, and this guy would be willing to sell his onion to the person who would be paying more than 100 rupees, that is the price which he got previously, let's say 200 rupees. So this is the situation. The reason for this is because of the supply side shock. Now let us imagine if the same 2 kgs are there, but there is an additional third person who came in to buy that onion. Even in that case, there will be a increase in the price. Therefore, it is very clear that if prices rise, the value of money will definitely come down, because previously 100 rupees was much more valuable in this example than it is the case after the prices have risen. So this is the example and the background that you have to understand for the concept of inflation. Depending on the percentage increase, they can be categorized as shown in the picture: 3%, 3 to 10%, 10 to 20%, and 1000% per year. Hyperinflation: running, walking, creeping. Just some static question that can be expected from this topic: the order of inflation. Just remember this. This graph is the Phillips curve, which talks about the relationship between inflation and unemployment rate. So what is the practical implication is what we have to understand. So this Phillips curve will tell us the kind of monetary policy and the fiscal policy that a government should adopt. That is, in our country, how much inflation should RBI target, and fiscal policy is about the measures that the government should take from their end through finance ministry to tackle a particular unemployment rate which is considered to be within the range. So this varies from country to country. This is all you have to know for Phillips curve with respect to UPSC preparation. Moving on. Economic survey with respect to global inflation talks about a few things. What are they? Now, we have discussed in the first chapter about the waterfall strategy, the agile strategy, and the calibrated approach taken by India. So, just to repeat what we have already discussed, advanced economies directly put money into the pockets of people irrespective of their economic status. So this is called the front loading of stimulus, and we have seen countries like Japan almost induced 53% of GDP into their economy, which will obviously increase money in the hands of people. And when there is a supply side shock, it will automatically lead to inflation, right? The same thing was mentioned in the highlights here. You can download the document and read it. Now, what is the trend of India and other advanced economies? Not just India, other emerging economies or developing countries. Let us have a look and what survey says about it. This is a graph which explains the CPI rates of emerging economies like India and that of advanced economies. Usually, this emerging economies do not have the technology, and therefore all the raw materials and technology will be much costlier. Therefore, the CPI rate will be much higher. But if you take a look at the post-COVID period, the rise in advanced economies is much higher because of the waterfall approach that they've taken in front-loading the stimulus. This is what this CPI chart also says. So if there is a question, the steeper curve after the pandemic with respect to CPI is observed where? In advanced economies or EMDs? It is advanced economies. Particularly if we talk about specific countries, the highest inflation rate of 7% USA witnessed since 1982, and UK hit a 30-year high of 5.4%, and inflation in Turkey is a whopping 36.1%. So this shows the calibrated approach that India took and the minimum impact of COVID on our economy according to Economic Survey. So this graph explains the comparative chart of US, Brazil, India and UK. You can see that we are somewhere around here, whereas Brazil has as high as 10.1%. Just remember that UK has a worst rate in 30 years. So did US since 1982. These are the points that you have to remember. Probably an ascending or a descending order of CPI is a possible question. Very unlikely, but still just know because it is mentioned in the economic survey. Now, here is where we will have to understand the basics of CPI and WPI. This is a chart which explains that WPI has risen significantly in the pandemic period. We'll understand what CPI is, what WPI is, and why is this divergence seen in the case of CPI and WPI. So what is the metric that is actually followed by RBI, whose one of the objective is inflation targeting? It is actually CPI. So Monetary Policy Committee has this mandate to set the inflation rate somewhere in the range of 4 plus or minus 2%. It is not important to find out the reason why these numbers are arrived at. It is technical in nature and does not serve the purpose for our exam preparation. Moving on, we will understand what CPI and WPI are. Coming back to the original equation, in an economy, there will be a supply side and a demand side. Supply side will have producers. Now, this producer should sell the product to someone, right? Now, if that product is sold in bulk, let's say like Alibaba.com, he is considered to be a wholesaler. Now, this wholesaler might sell that to certain middlemen. If you're talking about Indian context, this wholesaler can be someone sitting in a mandi who would be selling this to a kirana store. Now, this kirana store will be selling to the consumer. So, this transaction between the mandi and kirana store is called the wholesale market transaction. And this second part from the retailer to the consumer, that is from the kirana shop to the consumer, is called retail side of the transaction. There can also be direct retail stores, like we can take the case of supermarkets. They are also considered to be retail markets. In simple words, you can consider retailers to be middlemen. So wholesaler basically gets impacted if producer prices rises, and consumer will get impacted because of various other factors, because we don't buy in bulk. To understand this more elaborately and to quantify them, we have the wholesale price index and the consumer price index. What is the difference? Let us understand. Let us imagine a kirana store owner goes to a local mandi with a basket in his hand and procures certain goods to sell to the people in his area. Now, the next year, the same person finds that the basket which costed him, like say X rupees the previous year, has actually costed him X plus, let's say, 5% more. This 5% more is generally considered to be the wholesale price index. Now, what is put in this basket is really important for us to understand the perspective of the government and why these two metrics are measured. Like we have discussed, when we are talking about WPI, we are basically talking about the wholesale market. And in this wholesale market, you don't usually find people going there to the market to buy services. Let's say you want to go to a doctor, you would not go to a mandi. If you want to probably book a good resort for your holiday trip, you would not find that in mandi. So this wholesale market is something that is related to commodity trade, and in simple words, WPI cannot track services. So this basket of goods, if the reference year is say 2011, then that year is called the base year. What is the basket of goods that we are tracking here in the wholesale market? Does it constitute services? No. This is the first prelims point that you have to remember. Now take a look at this. Manufactured products constitute the highest percentage, 64.2%, and then you also have food articles and other items like fuel and power. Now, important point to note here. When we're talking about the basket of goods with respect to the calculation of WPI, three categories can be found. Manufacturing items, which constitute 64.2%, highest. And then you have primary items, which are categorized here. And then you have fuel and power. However, there is an important point that you have to note. Crude oil or raw fuel is considered to be a primary article, that is under this. And processed fuel, that is refined petroleum, comes under this component, fuel and power. Now, why is it important? Let us understand. But also remember that within manufactured products, you will also find food items like packaged foods. Apart from the 15%, 15.3% of food articles that you find here, there is also up to 9% of packaged foods within the manufactured products, together constituting around 24% for food items. You might be wondering, is this really important? Even if you don't understand all this, just remember about food and fuel, because they are going to be extremely important for our understanding of inflation. Now, whatever inflation that you find after one specific time period, that inflation rise of WPI is called WPI headline. This is another important point that you have to note. Now, what is the significance of this and why are we relating it to food and fuel? Let us understand. For example, let us consider we have an objective of improving the quality of democracy in a pilgrimage center like Tirupati. Now, this place is a tourist place which has a lot of visiting population. And when you're talking about the quality of democracy, what would you need? You need to target the voters, because they constitute the core part of the city, and the rest of the people who are continuously floating in that city. That visiting population does not really matter when you're conducting an election or talking about the quality of democracy. Similarly, if the government has to take control of the rise of prices, there are certain items which really matter, and there are certain things that the government can't really help. Now those factors are, let's say, food and fuel. Now why are we talking about food and fuel only? Because in India, agriculture is predominantly dependent on various factors including monsoon. Imagine we had a bad season, there would be rise and fall of production. It is a very volatile thing. And take the case of fuel. In the present times, you have Russia Ukraine crisis, and because of this crisis, there is a rise in the fuel cost because production has come down. There is more demand, but supply is not matching. These situations are not really in the hands of our nation. So, if we really have to focus our energy on things that we can control, we have to remove food and fuel from the calculation or the measures or policymakers should be taking with respect to WPI. That is called WPI core. Just like in the case of this debate about the core voters, that is the local population, and we are talking about WPI core, we are talking about everything that is in our situation, which excludes food and fuel, which is very volatile in nature. This is the WPI core that we're talking about. Another important concept for our prelims. This WPI is calculated by the Office of Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce. So this is another important prelims question that you have to remember. We have seen the difference between WPI and CPI here, and we wondered why the government was able to control this CPI but not WPI. The answer is in fuel. Fuel is something that India imports. So this inflation is called imported inflation. Imported inflation because we do not have this inflation under control. We cannot control fuel prices. Now, why did it rise so much? For this, the answer is at one point in 2020, the prices went below zero. That is, people were actually paying up money to store fuel. For storing fuel instead of selling, the demand was so low because of lockdown that the prices fell below zero. So when you buy something from this level, obviously the price rise as a percentage will be much higher. That is why it is so high. And this is not under our control. That is why it is called imported inflation. Another reason for our WPI rise is edible oils, because we don't have enough production. Almost 56% of the demand of edible oils is met through imports, out of which palm oil constitutes about 54%. That is why the Prime Minister recently talked about the national mission on edible oils. Okay, so the national mission on edible oils majorly wanted to focus on the northeast region for palm oil. And it is in this context only we have had in 2021 a question on palm as a exotic species. So the question's inspiration is the national mission on edible oils. Now that we are done with WPI, where we have understood how the wholesale market, like for the case of example Alibaba or a local mandi functions, and what is the basket of goods which constitutes 676 articles, we have discussed all those things. And important thing is it does not include services. Now, when we are talking about things that affect consumers at an individual level, obviously we don't buy things in bulk, and we do not just depend on goods. There are services like we might have to go to a doctor, we might have to deploy a chartered accountant service during filing income tax returns. Where are they counted? In CPI. So just like how a shopkeeper went to a mandi with a basket and bought certain amount of goods, and that basket of goods price rise is tracked in WPI, for CPI, that is the consumer price index also, we'll be tracking certain basket of goods. For this reason, I've taken the example of Amazon so that you can visualize better. We go to Amazon.com or Amazon.in, and in that cart put certain items. Okay, when you track the price of these items in a base year, let's say in 2011, and compare the prices, let's say after 10 years in 2021, the price rise as a percentage increase is considered to be inflation. As simple as this. Here it is wholesale and here it is directly by consumers, and therefore we are taking the example of Amazon, and it is a percentage. Percentage rise is inflation. As simple as this. Naturally, when we consider the consumer choices, the choices in rural areas can be quite different from that of urban areas. That is why we have CPI rural and CPI urban. But when we are talking about a pan India level, we are going to take a combined basket of goods which will be tracking together for all the policy purposes, including the monetary policy committee, which will be targeting inflation. So inflation targeting is CPI combined. Whenever we talk about CPI, it is CPI combined. Know this point. Moving on. Now, when we're talking about CPI and WPI, you have to notice one fundamental change. One is that CPI will also have services. Where are these services? You can find that under the heading of miscellaneous, like recreation, education, etc. Recreation means if you want to go to movies, they are also contributing to your basket of goods, right? So those will also be counted here. And there is fuel and light. But the important point that you have to remember here is when we're talking about individuals like normal consumers who are spending money for their transport, that petrol and diesel will be counted under miscellaneous head, not fuel and light. This is one point that you have to remember. However, the most volatile thing, that is food, you are talking about food and beverages which together constitute 45.9, but if you're just talking about food items, it roughly constitutes around 39% without beverages into consideration. When you go to a supermarket, you might buy a bottle of cool drink also, but that is not considered to be core. But food is something that is very core for almost all the consumers. So this is 39% in CPI. But when you're talking about WPI, we have seen that food items constitute 24% only. So when the food prices increases, CPI is more responsive. This can be a question in UPSC. Whether WPI is more responsive or CPI is more responsive. The answer is CPI, because the weightage given to food items is much higher in CPI than in WPI. But when you're talking about fuel, WPI is more responsive. Now, naturally, when we're talking about CPI, this whole thing is CPI headline. Just like in the previous case, we have examined WPI headline, this is CPI headline. Now, if you're talking about core, what is core? Let us see. So naturally, the volatile items like food and beverages and fuel and light, if you remove them, the number that you get, the basket of goods that you get constitutes core inflation or core CPI. At the same time, you also have to remember that when we are talking about the petrol and diesel, which is consumed by individual consumers, not in the transport sector or anywhere else, then that will come under miscellaneous, because it is something that is variable from family to family, but it is still very important. Now, refined core excludes even that petrol and diesel, because again, fuel and food are something that is beyond the government's control to a maximum possible extent. In order to objectively target those areas which can contain this inflation, refined core is a better metric according to the economic survey. So this is introduced, refined core. Just understand that difference. Moving on. Now we are talking about the calibrated approach taken by India. So what is this calibrated approach? In the first phases of the lockdown in 2020, just when the lockdown was announced, because of certain government's measures like PDS and free distribution of grains, the inflation, which was historically around 60%, was reduced to 32%. However, it is still a high percentage, and because of this, it contributed to CPI rise in our economy this year. Similarly, the government also discontinued LPG subsidy. So this contributed to around 27% of rise in CPI. The percentage is not really important. You just have to remember the fact that LPG subsidy is removed. And like in the case of crude oil prices, WPI has increased. Naturally, this will be passed on to the consumer also, and that is why we've seen petrol and diesel rates touching almost 110 rupees, 115 rupees in a lot of metros recently. And since they constitute a significant part of our consumption basket, that also contributed to around 35%. So the numbers are not really important. The main drivers are food, fuel, and LPG. This is what you have to understand. This graph is given in the economic survey, but this is not really important. I'm presenting this only to show the variable nature of this pink line that you can see here. It is very volatile because food is included here, and food production depends on season, and it also depends on various issues like storage, etc. This is all you have to know. And the next thing is, usually in urban areas, CPI is much higher because of food supplies only, because food should be transported. This transport cost is much higher in urban areas because they're getting them from rural areas. That is why CPI urban is slightly higher most of the times. But whenever there are supply side shocks, in rural areas also prices go up. This is just about the first lockdown time where there was a migrant crisis, and even before, PDS was not given. That is around the month of uh, first week of April 2020. So that is why you have seen almost equal level of inflation. After that, it significantly came down, as you can see here. In the last slide, I'm presenting the comparative analysis or a table of WPI and CPI for prelims. You can download this from the Telegram channel link that I will be posting in the description box below. So this constitutes everything that you have to know about inflation. Just practice previous year questions after watching this video and you will be done with the topic of inflation. I request you to like, share and subscribe this video if you found this useful, which is as precise as it can get with respect to the topic of inflation. And part 2 of the video will be dealing with mains aspect with respect to analysis of the topic of inflation. That's it for now. Thank you guys.